Most people know Malcolm Gladwell as the man who asks the questions nobody else thought to ask. The writer who finds hidden patterns in messy human behavior. The voice that whispers, "Wait, what if we've been thinking about this all wrong?" But very few understand where that curiosity came from, or why he became obsessed with decoding the invisible architecture of success, failure, and everything in between. Before the books that rewired millions of minds, before the TED Talks that became cultural touchstones, before he became the interpreter of invisible forces, Malcolm was a boy caught between two worlds. His mother, Joyce Plaskett, was an English-Canadian schoolteacher and writer. His father, Graham Gladwell, was a Jamaican educated at Oxford. He grew up in rural Ontario, a mixed-race child in a predominantly white community, the grandson of a revolutionary Jamaican businesswoman, searching for patterns that others couldn't see. This is where it began. Not with answers, but with questions. Relentless, curious, sometimes uncomfortable questions. Malcolm Gladwell's life is not a story of inevitable success. It is a story of obsession. The obsession to understand how the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Why some people succeed against impossible odds. Why some ideas spread like wildfire, while others languish in obscurity. And why the rules we think govern human behavior are often completely wrong. This is the story of how one curious mind, shaped by displacement and cultural duality, became the voice that changed how an entire generation thinks. To understand Malcolm Gladwell, you must understand the people who came before him. On his mother's side, he inherited a legacy of fearless questioning and unconventional thinking. His maternal great-grandmother, Daisy Hawkins, was a Black Jamaican businesswoman and entrepreneur who refused to accept the limitations imposed on her. She built enterprises, wielded influence, and taught her descendants that the system could be challenged, that the invisible rules governing society were not immutable. On his father's side, academic excellence and measured intellectualism. His father, Graham Gladwell, was educated at Oxford during an era when Jamaican access to such education was not guaranteed. He represented the possibility of transcending circumstance through intelligence and persistence. Malcolm was born on September 3, 1966, in Guelph, Ontario, the youngest of 4 children. His household was filled with books, conversation, and the quiet understanding that ideas were currency more valuable than money. His mother wrote, his father taught. Together, they modeled something crucial, the belief that the world is comprehensible through careful observation and that your role is to decode it and share what you discover. Malcolm's childhood was marked by a peculiar form of displacement. He was not quite Jamaican, though his father was. He was not quite white, though he lived among white Canadians. He was not quite part of any group, yet he could observe all of them. This outsider status, while sometimes painful, became his greatest asset. When you don't fully belong to any group, you develop a superpower. The ability to see patterns that insiders cannot see because insiders are too embedded in the assumptions that make those groups function. Raised in Compton, Ontario, and later in Millbrook, Ontario, Malcolm attended schools where he stood out. His intelligence was obvious, but so was his differentness. He learned early that the world operated according to hidden rules, and that understanding those rules was the path to navigating it successfully. His mother was a writer, and she filled the house with books and stories. From her, he learned that language is a tool for making sense of chaos, that narrative structure can illuminate truth, and that the best writers are those who notice what others miss. From his father, he learned intellectual rigor, the importance of evidence, and that claims must be substantiated through careful reasoning. But the most important lesson came from the space between these two influences. The realization that complex human behavior cannot be fully explained by any single framework, that you must always be ready to revise your understanding, that the best ideas are often counterintuitive. Malcolm Gladwell was not a naturally ambitious person in the conventional sense. He did not dream of power or wealth or conventional success. What he dreamed of was understanding. He attended the University of Toronto, where he studied history and English literature. But his real education happened in the spaces between classes, in conversations with friends who thought deeply about why society worked the way it did. He could have become an academic. He had the intellectual capacity, but academia felt too narrow, too constrained by disciplinary boundaries. So instead, he became a journalist. In 1982, at age 16, he began writing for the student newspaper. But he didn't write about campus politics. He wrote about ideas. He asked questions about why people believed what they believed, why systems persisted despite their obvious dysfunction, why the invisible forces governing human behavior were so invisible. After university, he moved to Indiana to work for a newspaper, but his true calling was waiting. In 1987, at age 21, he joined the Washington Post as a reporter covering business and science. Here, in the pages of one of America's most prestigious newspapers, Malcolm began his real work. The work of noticing patterns that shaped entire industries, entire populations. He covered agricultural business and science stories for 9 years. In that time, he developed a methodology that would define his entire career. The ability to take a narrow, specific incident and trace its implications backward and forward, revealing the hidden architecture that made it possible. He wasn't just reporting the news. He was asking, why does this story matter? What does it reveal about how we think? What assumption does it challenge? The moment that changed everything came in 1996, when Malcolm became a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine. This was not just a job change, it was a release. At the New Yorker, Malcolm was given something he desperately needed: space. Space to think deeply about a single story for months. Space to follow ideas wherever they led. Space to write in the way he had always wanted to write. Narrative, character-driven, idea-centered, asking the reader to think differently about something they thought they already understood. His first major New Yorker story was about a teacher named Jaime Escalante, a Bolivian immigrant who taught calculus to poor Latino students in Los Angeles. Every one of his students passed the advanced placement exam, every single one. In a school where most students dropped out before graduation, Escalante's class was an anomaly. But when Malcolm researched the story, he didn't find what journalists typically found in such stories. He didn't find a superhero teacher single-handedly defying the odds. Instead, he found something far more interesting: a specific set of conditions, a particular culture, a narrative of belonging that transformed how students saw themselves and what they were capable of achieving. The story became the tipping point, and it introduced the world to Malcolm's methodology. That extraordinary outcomes are not the result of extraordinary inputs, but of specific, identifiable patterns operating at scale. Throughout the 1990s, Malcolm published story after story in The New Yorker, each one following the same basic structure. He wrote about crime in New York City and discovered the broken windows theory. He wrote about the power of epidemiology to understand social behavior. He wrote about the strange patterns in international business success. With each story, Malcolm was teaching readers a new language, the language of looking beneath the surface, of asking better questions, of refusing to accept conventional explanations for complex phenomena. In 2000, Malcolm published The Tipping Point: How Little Things Can Make a Big Difference. The book was not about one grand theory, it was about 3 principles: the law of the few, the stickiness factor, and the power of context. For example, he explained the sudden dramatic decrease in violent crime in New York City during the 1990s, not as the result of better police work or economic improvement, but as a social epidemic. Crime had reached a tipping point where it reversed, spreading the opposite direction like a virus spreading health instead of disease. The book became a cultural phenomenon. It was translated into dozens of languages. It influenced policymakers, business people, educators, and ordinary people trying to understand their own lives. But more importantly, it introduced millions of readers to Malcolm's core insight that the world is comprehensible, that hidden patterns exist, that by understanding these patterns, we can exert influence over outcomes that seem determined by forces beyond our control. In 2008, Malcolm published Outliers, The Story of Success. This book was a deliberate provocation. Americans believe in the self-made man. We believe that success is the result of individual talent and hard work. We celebrate the entrepreneur who comes from nothing and builds an empire. This narrative is embedded in our culture, in our laws, in our very sense of what makes someone worthy of respect. But Malcolm asked a radical question. What if this narrative is wrong? What if outliers, people who succeed in exceptional ways, are not so exceptional in their individual qualities, but rather are people who benefit from specific historical accidents, particular community structures, and advantages that are often invisible to those who enjoy them? He traced the lives of extraordinarily successful people: Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, the Beatles, wealthy Jewish lawyers from New York in the 1930s who became the founders of major law firms. And in each case, he found the same pattern. Bill Gates didn't succeed because he was a genius. He succeeded because his parents could afford to send him to a private school with computer access at the exact moment in history when computers were becoming important. Because his mother knew someone at the University of Washington who gave him access to university computers. Because he was born at the exact right time to exploit the emerging software industry. The Beatles didn't become great musicians because they had innate talent that exceeded other musicians. They became great because they were booked to play 8 hours a night in Hamburg, Germany, night after night, forcing them to develop their craft in a way that no other band experienced. In Outliers, Malcolm was making a dangerous argument that individual excellence is not the primary determinant of success, that luck, timing, cultural legacy, and historical accident matter enormously, that the rules we use to evaluate and reward people are fundamentally unfair because they ignore the context that makes success possible. This infuriated some people, because if success is not purely the result of individual merit, then we must acknowledge that the system is rigged, that privilege is real, that inequality is not always deserved. But it inspired others, because if success is contextual, then we can change the context. We can create conditions where more people succeed. We can question our assumptions about who deserves what and why. Malcolm's subsequent books continued this pattern. Challenging received wisdom by revealing hidden architecture. Blink explored rapid cognition, the ability of the human mind to make accurate judgments based on thin slices of information. But he also warned about the dangers of unconscious bias, how our minds make decisions that contradict our values. David and Goliath took the biblical story we all think we understand and revealed that we have understood it completely wrong. David was not the underdog we imagine. He was the stronger combatant. Goliath was not an invincible giant, but a man with a medical condition that made him vulnerable to stone throwers. By revealing the hidden architecture of the story, Malcolm changed how we think about advantage and disadvantage, strength and weakness. What the dog saw was a collection of his New Yorker essays that demonstrated the evolution of his thinking, his growing understanding that the world is far more complex and counterintuitive than we assume. Each book followed the same pattern. Start with something we think we understand. Reveal that we don't. Show the hidden forces that actually determine outcomes. Invite readers to think differently. So, what is the Malcolm Gladwell method? It is essentially a commitment to looking beneath the surface. It is the belief that the world is comprehensible, that patterns exist, that by asking better questions, we can understand complex phenomena. It is the refusal to accept the first explanation offered. It is the insistence on finding primary sources, on understanding context, on recognizing that human behavior cannot be reduced to simple formulas. It is the understanding that outliers teach us something important, that exceptions to the rule are not anomalies to be ignored, but data points to be examined, that by studying what works, we can understand what doesn't. It is the commitment to nuance, to acknowledging that most important questions do not have simple answers, that context matters, that the same action can have completely different outcomes depending on the surrounding circumstances. And crucially, it is the belief that ordinary people can understand complex ideas if those ideas are presented clearly through narrative and example rather than jargon and abstraction. Malcolm Gladwell's gift to the world is not a set of answers. It is a methodology for asking better questions. Malcolm Gladwell's legacy is not a set of best-selling books, though those matter. His legacy is the permission he has given an entire generation to question authority, to ask, but why? To refuse to accept conventional explanations, to look for hidden architecture, to believe that understanding is possible. In a world that rewards certainty, Malcolm has made a career of productive doubt. In a time of increasing complexity, he has suggested that complexity can be navigated through careful observation and better questions. His life teaches us that the most important insights often come from those who live between categories, who don't fully belong to any single group, who maintain the capacity to see what insiders cannot see. It teaches us that success is not what we think it is, that talent matters less than we believe, that luck, timing, and context are far more important than we admit. Most importantly, it teaches us that the world is not fixed, that by understanding the hidden rules, we can potentially change them, that by recognizing the patterns that shape our behavior, we can choose differently. The next time you encounter a pattern you don't understand, pause. Ask better questions. Look for hidden architecture. Trust that the world makes sense, even if that sense is not immediately obvious. That's Malcolm Gladwell's gift to us. Not answers, but the courage to question everything.